All right, so day 13, how time flies. So over the weekend, I played, as I mentioned and as I showed you in this link, I was playing with my interface, which takes so much wonderful time, but I didn't do a video because I really think this is fairly straightforward, but I'm going to go over it today just to give you the how I implemented it. Okay, so first you need to take the user array for the user login and creation and change it into an object and test to make sure it handles that creation, login, and creation correctly. So for me, and let me just show you, so on my JavaScript file, I just added a my users, and now instead of array, you have the curly braces, which indicates an object, and in this case, an object literal. And then I gave it a name. Now, what I did is, for testing purpose, you want to play around with this. I went ahead and gave it just some default values, but my update does indeed work. So you could have these as blank because you're populating it, but because I was playing around with my interface, I wanted something I didn't have to create each time. And just like before, it will go away if you don't do, on the form submission, if you don't do the returns, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so first I did that just to set up the object for to store the user creation and then compare. So in here, there's really only slight difference in the code. So instead of doing a push, I just did my users dot name, which you're learning a lot about this week in Free Code Camp. So I still got a variable name looking at that value within that form, in this case specifically by the ID. And by the way, this couldn't be one line. I had it two before. And this really speaks to the idea of understanding the document object model as it relates to each item or each drill down. Something I was playing with earlier in the structure, but we'll go back to that later. But anyway, coming back here, so my users is my object, dot the name is the attribute name, property name within the object, and then I set equals here. Okay. Nothing really different there. And then what I did here is I said if login name, and again I queried that value on the user, but this time on the comparison I have to say my user dot name. So that's relatively, I think, easy to implement that into your code, and again making sure that it's working. Okay, as it really, the logic is not working, it's just the way we're referencing the user information. So now I want you to implement content related to login and user creation that is shown after the onSubmit function call on both forms. So one thing I noticed is only a few of you, and that's why I did it in this step, had actually a distinction in your application about the difference between them. So I want you to think about that and implement that so that when the user logs in, you have some data about that as far as the user interface, the contextual information that the user would see. Okay, and then on creation. And I showed you mine last week, so the UI UX I ended up working on here was to add some of that first perspective user. And then I'm going to come back and then add in, when the user logs in, data specific to once they log in, and I'll do that next. Okay, I'll do that next, meaning I haven't done it yet, but you'll do it. I'll do it and I'll show you on Thursday or Tuesday, tomorrow. So the last thing on this week is I want you to implement a simpler listener. Now we did look at event listeners a couple weeks ago when we looked at the code from Rick. So I want you to implement that. We've been using the onSubmit, and I just showed here by looking at this link, and if you scroll down, really starting to understand, hopefully I'd actually say read this. And so here's the example, a very simple one for doing adding event listeners. And so you can see what the code is doing. You have a function, it's defining a variable, it's looking at an ID, and then it's asking the question if it's equal to, then change or make the first child node. And this is where we start to really start talking about what this means in terms of the DOM. Else make it 3. So this is just a function call that when it looks at get element by ID, this table, right? And so it's adding an event listener on the click that calls the modified text, right? And this is set to false because of what's called event bubbling. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. So this is just one example of ways you can do it. And I think a fairly good simple one. There are definitely higher end ones, and you can go down here and look at anonymous functions. But at least want you to implement the simple version somehow in your app. So for me, what I ended up doing was, and I just started to play around here, is on my button I have an event listener. Learn more, and as soon as you go over it, it changes it to the world needs us. When you go out, make it better, and if you click on it, then it puts some content above it. So it's a fairly simple implementation of the code that I just showed you. So I want you to do that, right? So that's what you have to do for this week. Really looking at those user stories, implementing some content related to that, and then this simple event listener, and then changing to the object. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.